everybody, welcome to a new RRG video. My name is Julius de Kempenaer and I am recording this on Thursday, the 19th of June, on Juneteenth. So it's actually a market holiday, which means that I can get an early evening here in Amsterdam. I want to take a quick look at what's happening in sector rotation, looking at the individual sectors, and then dive into the technology sector because first of all, it's the most important sector in the S&P 500 and it has been very volatile recently. It's been hopping in and out of my top 5 sectors, the blog that I'm maintaining, not in a particularly good way because that blog is based on a trend following strategy using RRGs, and when a sector just moves in and then moves out the next week and then moves back in the other week, that usually isn't very good for a trend following system. But we'll stick with it. We'll see what it's doing. And because this is such an important sector, I want to take a look at what's happening inside that sector based on the individual groups in that sector and some of the individual stocks. So we're going to start with sector rotation. Here is the current sector rotation RRG, and at least to me, the one that immediately stands out is the tail for XLK, for the technology sector. It's powering into the leading quadrant. It's got the highest RS momentum reading, and it's got a positive RRG heading. So that is a very strong tail that you see there. If we go over this image, then the other sector inside leading is the industrial sector, still inside leading, but losing a bit of relative momentum. And then we've got a whole cluster here inside the weakening quadrant. That's utilities and staples. Those are two sectors that are in my highest ranking sectors for quite some time. And based on the high readings in the RS ratio line, they can still remain in there without a problem. And then there is the communication services sector. And let me highlight that because that is starting to pick up. It's got a short tail. And as you know, short tails means that they're stable. So communication services in a stable relative uptrend that is going through a short setback. That's because of that short tail that you see there. Compare that to the tails for utilities and consumer staples. They are much more powerful. In an ideal world, and this is just me trying to look ahead, it's not predicting anything, what you will very likely see is when you see the tail of, let's stick with staples. When you see the tail on staples shrinking, then the odds for it to turn back up are getting bigger. So this is still a decent setback. It's losing relative momentum, still in a relative uptrend, losing relative momentum. When that tail will get shorter, that means that the momentum is diminishing and that the odds for a rotation back up are increasing. Not the case yet for utilities and staples, definitely happening for communication services. And now we've got financials and real estate. Financials used to be inside the top 5 and it moved out. And you can see that this is moving towards the lagging quadrant. The top 5 is based on a combination of daily and weekly observations, so you can't really say based on this single chart why it is in or out the top 5. But this is traveling at a negative heading. And if you look at real estate, that is the same. They're almost on the same position inside the weakening quadrant, but the real estate tail is longer and moving at a steeper angle. So if I had to choose between the two, it would be real estate being more negative than financials. And that's based on the length of the tail and the angle of the heading. Let me get those back up. And then on the left-hand side, you can see materials rotating into the lagging quadrant. It's very close to the benchmark, which usually means that it's moving in line with the benchmark. But here you can see how that tail is almost moving straight into the lagging quadrant. So that's a negative point. And now we've got healthcare, which based on this RRG is the weakest sector. It's got a very long tail and it's got a very negative RRG heading. Not so much for energy, which is turning around inside the lagging quadrant. It's very early, but it's picking up relative momentum and it's starting to move higher. So looks as if things are on the improving hand. And then here we've got another good example for a short tail. This is the consumer discretionary sector. It's on the left-hand side. It's got the third lowest reading in terms of RS ratio, so it's in a relative downtrend. It's picking up some relative momentum, but look at all these tails are 3 nodes. So 1, 2, 3 segments, 4 nodes, 3 segments. There is a massive difference between those tails and then consumer discretionary. And when you've got that short tail, it means that it is a very stable. I said it on communication services, but this is an even better example. A very stable, in this case, relative downtrend, which is picking up a little bit of momentum, but the odds for this to roll over and come back down into lagging are actually pretty high. When we move this to the daily version of the RRG, we got a lot more granularity and you will see a lot of differences. But you will also see that, for example, technology is moving back up into the leading quadrant. And if you look at the rotation here, you can see how technology moves through weakening, started to pick up and is now back up inside the leading quadrant. Look at that tail, that's shrinking there, shrinking right there. So very short tail for technology, stable relative uptrend on the daily, which is confirming the one on the weekly. And you can see how communication services is starting to pick up again. So that's getting back into shape. And that sector is still in the higher regions on the ranking. And you see how communication services moved. This is, I still find this so enlightening because look here, we're now at the start of the month in June. You see how short that tail for communication services is. And now we scroll forward using the arrow keys. You can see how communication services remains very close to the benchmark, meaning it moves in line with the benchmark. And then all of a sudden, it starts to pick up and move into the leading quadrant. And you can see the pickup of like, this is almost stationary here. It's almost stationary. I've got to zoom in really hard to show that rotation. And then this is super magnified. And then you scroll forward and you can see how that move is all of a sudden shooting off into the leading quadrant, confirming the longer term strength for the communication services sector. You can also see here why energy is picking up, why that weekly tail was kind of pointing upwards. That's because of that strong move on the daily. And you can also see why staples and utilities are continuing into the weakening quadrant. And this is actually a move which is confirming, but not in a good way, because here you can see how, let me highlight staples and utilities, how they are, or they were going through a positive stint and then they rolled over and now they're back into the lagging quadrant on the daily chart. And on that weekly tail, you saw those two tails for utilities and staples moving deeper into the weakening quadrant. And that's kind of confirmed now by this weakness on the daily chart. So combining that weekly and daily, that negative heading on the weekly, and then this weakness on the daily makes me at least aware of the possibility that the stint of utilities and staples as high performing sectors might be behind us. I'm not sure. We're going to wait and see what happens there. Obviously, in that ranking, there is a bit of a disconnect now because utilities and staples are clearly very defensive sectors, technology not so much, communication services not so much. And with all the geopolitical havoc that's going on around the world, I don't know what's going to happen over the weekend and how markets will, react maybe on Friday, probably when you see this, or over the weekend next week. They can go anywhere. So I'm going to stick with the trend analysis, and we do that for better and for worse. And if you look at the rotations, at the moment, it looks as if those utilities and staples sectors are rotating out of favor. On the weekly, they're still on very high readings. So when things go sour and everybody is flying into defensive sectors, which pretty much means utilities and staples, it's only a short stint on the daily for these two sectors to move back into leading and to have those weekly tails curl up in weakening and go back up. Mind you, this is all based on relative strength. So it is very well possible that all sectors and the market are going down, and you will still see sectors popping up inside the leading quadrant. The only thing what that says, what that means, is that they are outperforming the market. So when the market is down 5%, those sectors are down 2%, they are outperforming the market by 3%, and that will very likely make them pop up inside the leading quadrant. Back to the other sectors here. Industrials, still one of the stronger sectors, going through a setback. Real estate, decently. Healthcare, very weak on the weekly RRG. Pretty good on the daily, but you can see that it's already starting to lose relative momentum on this daily chart, and so does materials. So these two sectors are at risk. And here you see how consumer discretionary is now moving further down on the RS ratio axis, which means losing relative strength. All in all, most important moves for technology and communication services in a positive way. And I think that the consumer discretionary and healthcare sectors are kind of confirming on the other end, on the negative end of the spectrum. Now, from this RRG for sectors, let's move and zoom in on the technology sector, XLK. And the first step you can go straight through the stocks inside the technology sector. We're going to do that later, and you can do that here by selecting XLK members. That'll bring up an RRG which has all the stocks inside the technology sector. But I want to show you something that I think is probably overlooked a lot of times. And that's when you go to your dashboard and you will find the sector summary widget. And if you click on the sector drill down on the bottom right of that widget, it'll bring up a table with the sectors. And we're interested in the technology sector at the moment. And if you go to that icon right here, that's the RRG icon at the end of the line, and you click that, it will not give you all the individual stocks, but it'll give you a breakdown of the groups inside the technology sector. This is against the S&P 500. I prefer to do that against the sector index. So I'm going to change that to XLK and then save it. And now I have an RRG that shows me the groups inside the technology sector against the technology sector index. And that helps me to zero in, to zoom in into the groups within the index. So not yet the individual stocks. And what you see here is an interesting picture, an interesting image, because very clearly it is not all groups in the technology sector that are doing really well against the sector. So this is helping you to find the best groups inside one of the better sectors. And I think that the group that looks best is, well, we've got to look in here. It's probably going to be USSC or USEC or US, and those are Electrical Components and Equipment Index, the software, no, that's not the one, the Electronic Equipment Index, that's the AI, that's a confusing name. I think this sector existed before AI existed, so that's it. And in the blue end, we have the semiconductors, of course. All the other tails are not that well. So this is renewables. This is, let me take those off and bring the rest back on. So now they're all back on. So this is computer hardware. This is telecommunications equipment. And this is computer services. And this is renewables. And this is software. So out of these groups, it is the semiconductors, the electrical components and equipments, and the electronic equipment index. These groups are the ones that are the strongest inside the sector.
If you like my videos on RRG and you like to have the same functionality as what I'm using in my videos, you need to get a subscription to Stockcharts.com. It'll open up all the functionalities that I am using in my videos, and it will help you to get a better angle on your holdings and create investment ideas. So if you don't have a subscription yet, get a free trial, and after that, we'd love to see you as a subscriber to our service.
So the next step is to see if we can find individual stocks in those groups that are worth looking at. I'm going to leave these groups open. I'm going to open a new RRG, general one, and then load up the stocks in the technology sector. Because if you look at that, that's a pretty wild RRG. Let me make those tails a little shorter. That is helping to begin with, but still, this is a pretty crowded canvas. And that's why I wanted to go to the groups to basically zoom in on a group level first, and then move from the group into individual stocks. You can do it here. You could, for example, go to industries, sort on industries, and then I'm gonna first, if you click on this header, it'll take off all the symbols. And now I'm gonna highlight the semiconductor. So now we have selected all semiconductor stocks. And now I have the semiconductor stocks against the technology sector index. And now I can actually zoom in because I know that that group as a whole is doing really well. And now I'm going to zoom in into the individual stocks in that group. And you can see how this RRG is much more readable than the one that has all technology stocks on it. So very quick analysis here. MCHP, MU, NVDA, kinda, LRCX, AVGO starting to move, KLAC, very short tail, high reading, very good, and then possibly ADI moving into the proper direction. So let me show you how I would do that using a chart list, because the next thing that I wanted to show you is how can I find in a chart list all the semiconductor stocks inside the S&P 500. So basically this group without having to basically toggle them on or off. The way you do that is by going to the advanced scan workbench. And this I usually throw away. This is the initial setting. And I use the choice boxes right here. So first of all, I want my stocks to be inside the S&P 500. So I'm going to add that condition, group is S&P 500. And then I want them to be in the technology sector, which is right here. And I want them to be semiconductors. I'm going to add that here. And what you see is group is S&P 500 and group is semiconductors. And if I run that scan, it'll give me 17 stocks which are in the S&P 500 and in the semiconductors group. Now, it's very well possible that these 17 stocks are not the same as the ones that you see here. Maybe they are. Let me just check how many there are. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Well, the reason is that there is a maximum of 50 ticker symbols on an RRG, and we choose them based on market capitalization. So apparently there are 3 semiconductor stocks that are not in the 50 highest market capitalization in the technology sector. So that it is what it is. What I'm going to do now is I'm probably going to speed this up when I edit the video. I'm going to go over all these tails, bring up the individual chart, and then basically highlight if I think it is worth looking at. Here we go. And here we are. You saw me browsing the charts of the stocks and trying to relate that back to the tails. And these are the ones that have, in my opinion, a strong tail, a strong relative strength picture, and combine that with either a breakout or a strong trend in the price chart, on the price chart. AMD was a bit of a surprise. I hadn't expected that, but that looks really nice. And then you got the usual suspects. You can see how these long tails correspond with really strong charts. The one that I was a little bit confused about was Qualcomm, because the chart was kind of okay, but then you see that tails like, no, never mind. And then there was one stock in there which I was searching on the RRG, which is not in the top 50 of technology stocks. OMON, I think it was. Let me see, it's something with an O. Yeah, here. So this is, I kind of like this because big base and then moved higher and still got some room upside. So ON Semiconductor Group, which is not in the top 5, unfortunately, or the top 50 for technology stocks, unfortunately. So just a quick view on how you can drill down from your high-level sectors into the groups of the technology sector and then find individual stocks that have good potential inside, in this case, the semiconductor group, because that's what we zoomed in on. And these are the ones. And you could do the same exercise with those other groups that we have. And that would be electrical components and equipment, and not so much software and electronic equipment index. You can do the same scan. You can actually save them in a group, because what I did here is I just said sharp charts, and then it gives you this list of charts that you can browse through. You can save it as a group and then, basically look at it and just do the individual chart, tie it to your default chart format and look at it like that. So wrapping it all up on this US holiday, the landscape, the investment landscape, still a lot of uncertainty because of all the geopolitical stuff that's going on. We've got to deal with it. We'll try to navigate around it. I'm using RRGs to do that. Technology, as I said, most important sector in the S&P 500. At the moment, it is rising in the ranking. It's moving up, but that can change very rapidly, as we've seen over the last few weeks. We'll just have to wait and see. We'll stick with the approach. We'll stick with the trend following. We'll look at relative strength. We'll find the strongest tails on the weekly and the daily RRGs and keep on top of all these sector rotation moves. For now, semiconductors within technology looks really good. And that drills down into the individual stocks that we just showed you on the weekly RRG for semiconductors. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to leave a comment, share your opinion, and I'd love to engage in a discussion. Maybe you have some other views. Just let me know and we'll talk about it in the comment section of this video. Thanks again for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in the next video on RRG.